So Anish, you had two important conversations with our colleagues from India, Dr. Singh and Dr. Venkatesh, about the COVID surge, which hopefully is now getting a little bit better. Tell me, I mean, what's your reaction to the development in India? Did that change your perspective on what should be done in terms of lockdowns? At least that seemed to be the opinion of one of our guests.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, India does really change your perspective in terms of, what's possible even, far into the epidemic, I guess. I mean, it's just, it's humbling to know that despite the fact that a fair percentage of the population may have had the infection or have been through waves before, that, the subsequent wave could be much worse. It is so complicated though, because it's so hard to parse. Once you have panic set in, there's so much damage done because of panic, right? So, in New York, there was ventilators being overused. In India, it may be, who knows what's going on with, a lot of problems because of oxygen, just not having basic oxygen.
Right.
And what exactly is precipitating that? Is that really driven? Is that all demand, or is that demand that's driven because of panic? Some so-called run on the banks. There's all these
hoarding, right?
Yeah, there's all these reports of young people that seemingly are having much higher mortality. But then also cases of Mucor, suggesting there's overuse of steroids. When people are panicking, I think I think you just scale what happens. So how bad things can be. So, but I think I still don't quite understand. I started out from a position of it's just too expensive to keep populations expensive, not just from a monetary standpoint, expensive from a life standpoint, to keep populations the way we are now. In some mass mitigation strategy for any extended length of time. And then it felt like we should be doing more in terms of quarantining, at least. Or I remember being very upset about New York and how nobody was trying to kind of put a border around New York and everyone is allowed to leave New York. And Cuomo was suing the governor of Rhode Island if she tried to stop people on the highway. And I remember being very upset about that. But then as time and the months passed, it became, this became obvious how global this is. It's like, well, it's like whack-a-mole, right? You block China, but it comes in from Italy. If you blocked Italy sooner, maybe it would come in elsewhere. Like, how long in a large, massive population that is an island nation that has very extensive travel across its borders for whatever reason, how long can you keep a population under wraps for? So, even India, I think even India, like when I spoke to both, Dr. Venkatesh and Anupam, I don't know that either of them would be, felt it would be practical to lock down the entire population. Then it gets down to these nuances of, should you have had the Kumbh Mela, which is this massive religious exercise, Hindu festival where millions of people come to a certain state and then they go back. Was that a massive super spreader event, or these political rallies, or is that what caused it? I don't know. It's very hard to know, hard to predict. I think India kind of shows that, well, yeah, if you're a year into a pandemic and most of the population is not vaccinated or recovered from, and by most I mean maybe much more than half, you're not vaccinated or not recovered from a prior infection, then you can still have a very, very, very bad outbreak. And so perhaps that's the lesson for the future.
Right. Let's talk about this particular point for now. So is that the nail in the coffin of the herd immunity position, meaning the people who thought that they could tell that herd immunity had been achieved, or or was achieved? I mean, we had on our podcast, we had Dr. Gomez in, I think, back in May or June.
Yeah.
And she was talking about a few places in Europe that, based on her models, that she thought the herd immunity threshold had been reached. And similarly, was the same talk was made about India.
Yeah. It certainly doesn't seem like it. Well, it certainly doesn't seem like the percentages that were being thrown about before can be relied on. I mean, I think India and a couple other places, Manaus and Brazil, seem to suggest that even if you have reasonably significant outbreaks prior, it's possible to have a worse outbreak. But it's so hard. I mean, India is a unique situation. I mean, Delhi is, I think Delhi is like 25 million people, if, greater Delhi. And it's very dense and multi-generational families. And yeah, so I think even if, say, and they were saying, the seropositivity in Delhi, for instance, was, I think, 55%. And so that gave folks some confidence that, hey, that plus, these T cells would meant that India was resistant. And that's why this wasn't breaking out in India. But, 55% of, say, 25 million population in Delhi still leaves
a lot of people.
12 million people that can get the infection. And if enough percentage of 12 million get an infection, then that can, create a run on the hospitals, healthcare resources, and collapse infrastructure. So I think, I think you have to be careful about how one interprets that, right? So does that mean that if York, Pennsylvania has 55% of their population that gets infected, or is seropositive, for instance, are they more resistant to COVID? I mean, I probably, so.
Right. I mean, the theory would say that it is a percentage, right? I mean, in essence, it doesn't matter if Delhi is 20 million or 2 million people, but with caveats that the percentage has to be sort of homogeneously distributed, right, throughout the population to
I guess
be
so, right?
barrier,
Because
that sort of thing.
Yeah, because R naught by definition is different, right? In York versus in Delhi, and so that would affect, each population probably has a different threshold in terms of what threshold it has to get to. Perhaps, I don't know. We're of course armchair. We're doing this on the armchair basis, but yeah.
But from the armchair, I think you're right, and I think, you're right that we should be cautious and we about these numbers and being too complacent. And then there's, on top of that, there's the question of variants and that sort of thing. To what extent it is the same organism versus a different organism, but so in response to this, at least Dr. Venkatesh was suggesting that the people had become complacent and were less careful about their distancing or these kinds of measures. And that may be a reason why the second wave was so much worse. I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, I don't know. There's so many variables that change.
But I mean, I think that's what he said. That's what I think Dr. Anupam said too. That just people were much less. I think that people assumed that since India had kind of gone through a wave and they expected something big to happen after December. It really didn't, and then so people were just really completely opening up. They thought they were protected, So
that's. I mean, it stands to reason that it would be an important factor, at least.
Yeah,
and that people did that. But then in response, I recall Dr. Venkatesh saying that that maybe the government should have been a little tougher, a little harder, and in particular with a less disciplined population. Which, in a way, I mean, if it's less disciplined, is it going to respond to? I mean, unless it's really martial law, right? I mean, it's hard to see that a population would be more disciplined.
Well, I mean, I guess the real question, the elephant in the room is, should every population enact what China did in response? Because in the end of the day, maybe is China the best response to a pandemic?
And tell me a little bit more, because I haven't followed that
I mean,
closely what
China,
China is doing, or
I guess
to the
China,
extent that we know.
yeah, to the extent, I mean, it appears that China perhaps was the most restrictive in terms of restricting individual rights and, during this pandemic. I mean, it appears that they would take positive family members and remove them by
Hmm.
force and put them in, if necessary, and put them
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
hotels,
Hmm.
COVID-19 hotels. It appears that they would, to prevent, families were infected, they would weld people into their homes so they couldn't leave. So I mean,
And that allows the prevalence to be low enough, then they can continually do contact tracing and isolation.
right? They can
To this day,
essentially they took a COVID zero strategy,
right,
which some of our colleagues are enamored by.
right, and that's
So
currently what they're doing.
no. I mean, I think they're no, absolutely not. I mean, Wuhan apparently is. If you Google one night in Wuhan, I mean, apparently they're having
Right.
orgies every night in nightclubs and bars and stuff. I
Right,
mean,
but
so,
presumably, are they still surveilling? I mean, they're surveilling passengers who travel, right? Travelers who come in. I mean, they must be doing some
right. From
surveillance.
the communications just on Twitter that I've received from folks is that they are still very careful about who is being let in. So
Okay, right.
they've controlled it in China. It's basically zero. They've had these mass surveillance things that show very small prevalences of COVID, and they're
Okay,
very careful about who they let in. I guess so.
okay, which they're able to do by virtue of being China and being having
Right, right,
essentially this kind of having the police state infrastructure
right.
um, to do. Um, right. So um, uh, I suspect. I mean, that argument can have appeal from a utilitarian
Yeah.
perspective,
This
right?
right.
New Zealand would be essentially in the same category, or
Yeah, New
just
Zealand,
except this, right? Yeah.
except New Zealand. I always get, I always slightly annoyed by the New Zealand comparison because it's an island which has very little travel relative to these large countries, both
Hmm.
inside New Zealand and coming from
Hmm.
coming from New Zealand. So, sorry, from coming outside New Zealand inside.
Right.
So, so China is massive, 1.4 billion people, massive amounts of travel within China. So, yeah,
But they've
the
managed
depth, yeah. So,
to limit the outside entrance. I mean, they can make themselves an island in that sense.
right. So so that's the interesting point that's made is that look, the most libertarian thing, the thing that allows for the most individual liberty is an initially very conscriptive, harsh approach from the center that basically says put the military out and say shoot to kill.
Right. Um, yeah. Is there anything in between? Is there a possibility of? I mean, obviously, most countries have been in between. In between, complete laissez-faire. I mean, in fact, I don't know that any country has been completely laissez-faire.
Yeah. Well,
But there
Sweden.
have been different degrees of it. Yeah, I guess Sweden would be the example of the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
And clearly, they haven't achieved the same successes, at least so far, that China and New Zealand have achieved.
Right. Right.
Right.
Right.
Um,
So what is our liberty worth, Dr. Akkad?
yeah, I don't know that to me, it's not. I mean, it's indirectly about liberty, but that's not the prime. Um, my prime criticism of lockdown measures. I think I'm against lockdown measures because they're outside of the scope of what I think the government or the political authorities should do. I mean, in general, I think the political authorities should not be interested in your individual health, you as an individual, even if it's a large number of individual health that are at stake, individual people whose lives are
Yeah.
at stake. It's a difficult uh, position to defend because it runs so contrary to what we're used to in our everyday life. I mean, there's a presumption that the government is there to, even when we say the government is there to
Yeah.
protect your rights, your individual rights. I think it's not the political theory that I
Yeah.
um, that I abide or hold to.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's just the respiratory viruses make things, or lethal respiratory viruses make things difficult, right? So if you have an 85-year-old grandmother who's living in Delhi, and you're seeing constantly tons of people milling around in common areas, they may be young, but that clearly is allowing for spread to happen. And the higher the prevalence there is of COVID, then the higher that your grandmother is at risk.
mhm.
You can see how you very quickly become somebody that wants the military out there to prevent people from leaving their houses.
Right, but I think that's an emotional response, and I don't think it's the right one. Um, so yes, at the end of the day, it has to do with what kind of society do we want to live in,
Right.
and I'd rather not live
Right.
in a Chinese society. You would say, well, what about a New Zealand society, which is not, it's more, liberal, or
Oh,
I mean, there are more personal freedoms in New Zealand in general, but
yeah.
it turns out that it doesn't. I mean, if it's able to act that way under these circumstances, then it can act that way under other circumstances with very little need to justify its actions. Right?
Right.
I'm talking. I mean, the government. So I think this is wrong. I mean, in the short term, of course, it's easy to justify because you can do the body counts and say, look, our death toll is much less. So that seems to provide justification in a very narrow sense.
Yeah.
In a larger sense, I think it weakens societies. I think it weakens society.
No, and I think that's the only way to make that argument. But of course, you have to make a very long vision argument, right? Because you can't separate out a
Right.
China that does that with a China that. This may be unfair to many anyone, but you can't separate this out from a China that did participate in the cultural evolution that did result in millions of
Right.
people dying.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the two things go together. And but yeah, I mean, it requires. So it's almost, that's why I don't know, I think you don't, I don't think you're fond of this analogy that I use frequently, but I think you have to, I kind of see it as a war, and or you have to view it as a war where, unfortunately there are going to be casualties, but it's a matter of what exactly are we fighting this war for?
You
But
mean
you have to
the
be very
war with
clear,
the epidemic? You view it as a war?
as in it's as in, like, we have obviously sent many millions of people from all nations to war, young people, 17-year-olds to beaches,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
half the way around the world to die for something,
Mm-hmm.
for some principles, right? To live free, or to live, the way society is currently constructed, or so if we've done that in the past, then if you're faced with some respiratory virus with some crazy R naught that is multiple times more lethal than the flu, then should we not also be accepting of some type of a body count in order to? That sounds very cold, but I don't know how else to. What else is there to do? I mean, that's what you're saying, right? We value these principles of free and open society so much that we are going to accept a higher death count, meaning there's no way around it.
Yeah, correct. But again, I mean, I would be careful with the way I wouldn't frame it that way. It's not that I'm defending the values of a free society. I'm defending um, the I guess you can call it the rights of people to. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a little quibbling here. But I want the people in this society to live well, and it's not the job of the political authority to go and I mean, their job. I mean, the problem with the war analogy is I think it tends to confuse things. It's precisely because an epidemic is not a war that the government should not be involved. right? I mean, it's a threat to your health, but it's not a war. In the same way that there's an intentional invasion of a foreign country to take over your country. If that's the case, then yes, the government can organize, conscript citizens, perhaps, to mount a
Mm.
defense.
Yeah.
But the virus is not. The virus is well, we think it's a natural. It's still an open question whether sort of it's a natural disaster, and and the defense against national disaster uh, should be left to the community itself, right? Insofar as there are private citizens, right? To organize, it doesn't need the involvement of the political authority. The citizens of the country need to learn how to defend themselves against this natural disaster, or how to prepare themselves better. And that's the problem in a way. In that our political systems for many decades, hundreds of years, in fact, a couple hundred years, have lost sight of that, and get confused, and the political authority gets involved in issues of health and whatnot, and defense against natural disasters and whatnot. And so we've gotten used to that, and therefore uh, the private community, the private society, has allowed, no longer has the know-how to organize itself, to respond to epidemics, to respond to other catastrophes, to become more robust. And I think if it were left to its own devices, to be it would do the job a lot better, and certainly in a much fairer way than when the political authority has to do it, steps in to do it. Um, so yeah, but that means, yes, perhaps yes, people on a short-term basis, you have a body count that is higher in your society against a natural disaster, but maybe not, because again, remember, we talked about it a few episodes ago, that in a more free society, which tends to be more prosperous and whatnot, you have lines of defenses like vaccines that can be developed much more quickly than in a very authoritarian society, right? And therefore, that's one way of defending your society without the need for the intervention of the public authority, of the political authorities,
Right.
right?
Right.
So you can have the vaccines be developed and be adopted on a purely voluntary basis,
Right.
and do well. Whereas now, with the involvement of the political authority, it's actually the opposite. So I mean, even in a society like ours, which is relatively prosperous and relatively free, and that can develop these vaccines and whatnot, what the involvement of the public authorities does is actually create suspicion or lack of trust, and
Right.
and you have half the population who refuse to get them because of suspicion. And so I'm not saying that they should be forced, but I'm venturing to guess that the adoption would be a lot greater if it was
Right.
done on a purely voluntary basis.
Right. That's one of the humbling things about COVID is like you can't ever call victory. You can't ever referee this. 1 month out, 2 months out, three
Right,
months out.
right,
We're
right.
18 months out or whatever, and you may still not be able to really referee this, right? Because
Correct.
it may
Imagine
very well
China,
be
right, slips. I mean, and maybe China could weaken, not on the extent of COVID, but maybe it would have a revolution or social unrest, or who knows,
right.
right?
Right.
Who knows what's happening 10 years from
Yeah, and I
now, right?
and I think that's a very fair argument to make, which should be made. I think it's just the destabilization that occurs in society because of mass mitigation that is overly done. And again, you know in the United States we have 3-year-olds that are still masked.
Hmm.
It's just, you can't separate all these things out. I think the folks on the one side, we'll call them the utopians, think that they're these highly skilled bureaucrats that know exactly when to lock down, exactly when to open up. And it seems pretty obvious to me that like they lock down too late. They they don't open up and they open up
Sure.
too late, meaning, and so in some senses, if we as the populace are constantly, as you're saying, suggesting that, give up thinking for ourselves and trying to evaluate risk for ourselves as communities and farm that out to the CDC, I think that's going to result in the end of the day with a way worse outcome. So is it better for the CDC or the CDC and the Department of Health in these various different places to decide when it is schools open, or should the local communities decide when it is schools should open? Who has a better understanding of that, and what damage does one do if you get it wrong? I think, yes, it's true that you can get it wrong. Local communities may get it wrong. It's not that they know all, but if local communities get it wrong, I think the scale of the error is going to be a lot less than if somebody in some central place gets it wrong. So
right.
so,
Yeah, it's going to be, or it could be, but as you mentioned a minute ago, you can't even really unless you artificially narrow um, the scope of how you're going to judge the success or the right of the policy. For example, if you say, "Oh,
right,
okay, it's only body counts," then on that
right,
count, maybe you don't know, right? Because you don't know what's
right,
going to happen 10 years from now. If China, 5 years from
right,
now has a big rebellion because of the
right,
law, who knows.
right,
So at the bottom line, if you can't use the consequence, right, that's in technical terms it's called consequentialism. When you judge the value of an action based on
mm,
the
right,
consequences
right,
of
right,
it,
right,
I don't think you can do that. I think that's
right,
wrong. Yet, by and large, our political life is consequentialist, right? It's always predicated on whether it's left or right. The left saying we're going to do this because the consequences will be better, and the right saying no, you should do that because the consequences will be better.
right.
It can't be that way. It
Mm,
has to be, is the action itself good or
mm.
bad, just or bad?
Yeah, that's an
And
excellent point.
generally speaking, if the action is good, the consequences will follow. You cannot
Mm,
control them, and it may be that at least the consequence that you hope for does not materialize.
yeah,
But nevertheless, it should be that the action itself should be good.
right.
And if the action is wrong, then you shouldn't do it. So lockdowns, the action itself is wrong because it forces, right. I mean, we talked about that. I mean, you have to define who's essential, who's not essential. You have to take actions. You separate
Right.
people. You do things that are intrinsically not right, and they shouldn't be. It shouldn't be done, and you'll have a more solid, more happy. I mean, at the end of the day, you want a happy society. You don't want you cannot have a society where people you can guarantee their lives forever. That's really ridiculous. I mean, it's utopian. You cannot guarantee lives. You cannot guarantee, uh, um, material. But you can strive towards happiness, towards a happier society, where people are more trusting of one another
Mm,
and that sort of thing. And to do that, you have to really very be very clear about what the scope of the political action should be, where it should manifest itself. And in my opinion, we're way too much. I mean, we've let the political authorities do way too much into our lives, and we've become dependent on it and dependent on political intervention to the point where we can't even imagine life without it.
mm, right.
Um,
Yeah. Well, of course, it doesn't help. No, that's very well said. Yeah, I mean, if you can't figure out, it's not. You're not playing football where you're
right,
not like
right,
there's no every 10 yards you get a first down. It's
right.
who knows? I mean, if who knows who's winning, who's losing in 2021 or 20. Maybe that'll be decided in 2030. So yeah, that's a very very good point. It is frustrating that libertarian arguments are kind of turned against themselves, right? Because that the famous adage of your right to throw a punch ends at my nose. Um, now, your right to breathe without a mask on
Right,
ends at my
right,
nose or
exactly.
something.
Yeah. So that's
Um,
not, in my mind, that's not a good argument for
yeah.
a small government society,
Okay.
right? I mean, because that's an argument that would say the government is right to intervene if
Yes.
you're right, if you're going to
Yes.
punch me in the nose to defend me.
Yes.
No, so the government should intervene then, but not to defend you or to defend your nose, but because by preventing criminal activity or of that sort,
Yeah.
then it allows the society to live better.
Right.
But it's not your own individual.
Well,
So it's a fine distinction, but it's a very philosophically it's an important distinction.
But what if they criminalize breathing?
Right. They can't. I mean, that's right. I mean, that would be. It's not. You can't criminalize not wearing a mask, because for a crime, the crime, it has to be an intention, right? There's no intention unless we remember we had that conversation with the professor of law, Dr. Rice.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you have somebody who's clearly recklessly infecting others.
Yeah.
Then yes, I think there may be grounds for the government.
But we would prevent somebody with Ebola from getting on a plane.
Correct. You would prevent. So here the action is against the virus. It so happens that the virus is attached to a person. Right. But
you see the problem, sir.
Yes. Yeah. It's not perfect, but I think it's better. So yes, we can quarantine viruses if they happen to be attached to a citizen. I'm sorry.
I have made you an autocrat. All right.
Right.
No,
yes,
that's why. Right. But I think it gets to this intuitive. I don't think you. There's something. I mean, you'd have to. There's something about risk that people intuitively understand that makes them recognize Ebola as different than COVID.
Right, but I mean, I think but let me actually backtrack a little bit and come back. So it's you can close the border. You're not quarantining a citizen. So you can close your border, right? That's a little different.
Yeah.
Now let's say somebody has Ebola inside the country.
Yes.
And what do you do then? Do you quarantine them? That's a good question. I mean, I guess. I mean, if if the only intervention left for the government would be to do that, I mean, and it deviates from my own principles, then so be it. But I suspect that would be sort of a pretty minimal threat.
Yeah, but it would be private individuals that would prevent somebody from.
Correct. I mean, I think again the private sector would
organize to do whatever.
Right, we're organized to isolate the threat.
Yeah,
right? It would not require necessarily government intervention.
In this case, the private sector has organized to test. The private sector may organize to mandate vaccine passports. It's a wonky world where risk assessment. It's best seen by the vast difference in what people think about the threat of COVID versus on the Democrat side versus on the Republican side, right? Democrat. I don't think I'm making this up. I think some percentage of Democrats or some segment of Democrats think if you get COVID, there's a 50% chance you get hospitalized, and so it's almost like our threat meter, our spider senses that all of us have is completely broken by Twitter and social media and CNN and whatnot, right? Like back in Oran, there's an understanding of threat that's very different than what it is now, right? Meaning, is that a path? Is that an intuitive path to out of this? Meaning, if we were to not hyperventilate, not be hyperbolic about a variety of about all these different things, and allow people to use sources of information that are more.
You're muted here. You muted yourself. Hang on.
Sorry.
Sources of information that are more what?
Meaning, do we live in a world where sources of information are more relevant? Meaning, I feel like sources of information are broken because it's Eric Fagelding and Yanir Baum talking about exploding hearts with COVID, and it's like, of course, like, how are people going to make threat assessments for themselves and differentiate Ebola from COVID and then act accordingly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but so I don't know that I mean, perhaps there's a sort of reinforcement from the media, but you started off by saying, Republican, the difference between Democrats and Republicans in their risk perception from COVID is vastly different. But I don't think it's that because of the media. I think it's the other way around. I think
No?
no, I think the left in general is more risk averse as far as those things are
No,
concerned.
their sources of information are so much different. CNN and how they talk about COVID is very different than Fox and how they talk about COVID.
Yeah, but CNN is on the left.
Right.
So it is by itself. It is. I mean, the people who run CNS. I mean, I would venture to say they themselves are more risk averse. I mean, I guess I mean that explanation, as opposed to saying they know that the risk is not that bad and therefore they. Oh
no! I think they believe. Yeah, right.
Right. So I think they believe. I mean, to some extent, I think generally speaking, the left is going to be more risk averse in terms of their. The material necessities of life.
Yeah.
And therefore, that's why it demands, government intervention. It demands welfare system, right? Welfare states and that sort of thing. Whereas the right, in general, is going to be less risk averse for that sort of things. Those sorts of things. They may be more risk averse for other, ideological. They may be more quick to shut down free speech. Possibly.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah. Or vaccines. They're much more hesitant about vaccines.
Right.
But that's my point. It's like we've broken the normal channels by which people are to make decisions for themselves.
Right. But I mean, I think naturally there's always going to be a spectrum of risk tolerance.
Yeah.
Right. And so how do you deal with that? But again, I mean, it can't be the political authority, because the political authority itself, they're going to have their risk tolerance is going to be dictated by either the most, who's the most politically vocal, or who's the most risk intolerant, perhaps precisely because they're going to be more agitated to ask the political authority to get involved and that sort of thing.
But we're in a peculiar point in time in history where everyone is incredibly connected, and everyone can either turn on something that is confirming the fact that COVID is way not as bad as it is, or turning on something that makes it 12 times worse than it is.
Right.
And but the same applies for,
right.
So I mean, it's a strange. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is here. It's like we're too connected.
We are, but I mean, I think the problem is this question of risk is. Risk is completely subjective. I mean, it doesn't have any reality. It's a completely psychological phenomenon.
Right.
So in a way, it's. I mean.
Like, were we better at? Are the folks the folks back in 1918? Don't they have a better understanding of risk of the virus based on their cues, their local cues, and who's sick around them, who's dying, how young people are dying? There's that basic knowledge that you get, but they don't have like some.
I see what you're saying. Right. I see what you're saying. So, correct.
Versus now.
Yeah. Yep.
Like, and that really like screws up how I think people.
Right. Respond. Correct. I mean, we anyway, we live unrealistic lives, or unnatural. I mean, in a way, we're sort of disconnected from the environment. That's true.
Right.
That's true. So that's a problem with modern life. At least the way it currently
like
is.
Our experience of modern life is looking on our phone on Twitter to be like, my God, what is happening out there?
Exactly.
Whereas in 1918, in order to figure out what's happening out there, I mean, they had to go, now we like order something on Uber Eats, we order something on this, and we're like, oh my God, look at this person. He fainted.
Yeah.
Lying in a marketplace. Holy crap.
Right. No, so it's true. And it's so our modern lives are very don't give us a good sense of reality. So I think that's correct.
You would agree then during pandemics, the government should shut down all internet activity
in order to ground us better, to get us back to our roots.
Michelle, all paths lead to China. I don't know.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think, on the contrary, I think it gives me an opportunity to criticize the educational system, the school system, right?
Yes.
Mandatory.
Yes.
I've been reading. We had David Cayley talk about Ivan Illich.
Yes.
So the last few
Yes.
months, I've been reading a lot of Illich, including
Oh.
stuff that he wrote against. He wrote a book in the early 1970s called "Deschooling Society."
Okay.
So he was big against. Um, Especially mandatory schooling,
Yeah.
right? Mandatory schooling, which is almost, it's a pillar of our
Right.
modern society. I mean, it's sacrosanct,
Yeah.
right? That we need to educate the kids so that they, you know, and I think he's absolutely right. I mean, I think the school system warps our view of reality
Yes.
tremendously. So we do things to kids, and kids come out of school, and in fact, not only school but even college and whatnot, with really very unrealistic, with essentially no experience of real life. And we know that in medicine. In medicine, it's worse and worse because they perpetually, are getting taught things that have almost no use to take care of patients.
Right.
Whereas medicine is really a very practical thing. I mean, people should go into apprenticeship at age 18 if they want to go into medicine from the get-go. I mean, I'm not saying that there's no role for a classroom. Of course, there is, but but uh, but the point is that uh, our educational system is completely, or in largely disconnected from reality, and shields people from experiencing life. And it's not only our educational system, but it's also labor laws, right? Where at age 14 you can't work, right? When in fact you should be able to work. There's a psychologist at Harvard who wrote quite a bit, is writing quite a bit about that. Roger Epstein, I think is his name. Are you familiar with him?
No.
He essentially he wrote quite a bit over the last 10, 20 years against this perpetual, this extended infantilization um, of life, right? I mean, we keep what school does to people, to what we're doing to our children in school. We're just, it's a perpetual, if not a childhood, but it's an extension of adolescence forever. Whereas he thinks that at age 14,
Yeah.
they immediately should be confronted to, I mean, confronted, meaning placed, you're immersed into real life. Adolescents should be adolescents should be given real job opportunities, and and mature that
Yeah.
way. Whereas now we're, and that includes my generation. I mean, it's nothing new, but my generation, I personally realized, I mean, how long I was, I didn't, I don't want to give you yet another opportunity to make fun of how old I am, but I finished my cardiology training. I think I was 32 or 33,
Yeah.
and up until then, it means that I was still kind of, you know, uh, not a child, but in a way, I didn't really have any kind of real
Yeah.
solid life. I mean, I didn't have the responsibility of having a household and that sort of thing, and making real life decisions. And that's true across the board, and we're extending it and expanding it, and certainly with the Democrats in power now, I mean, there's going to be uh, more motion in that direction.
Right.
um, so um, so that's why we the risk aversion comes from that as well. I suppose, I think uh, I haven't read his book, but I imagine Jonathan Haidt, the coddling of American minds. I suspect that his arguments are similar to
Right.
what I'm saying here.
Yeah. No, no,
Um,
absolutely.
so yeah, on the other hand, people have been saying this. I mean, I mentioned Illich talking about this 50 years ago. So are we prophets, or are we, on the contrary, Cassandras? And it's just the world has changed, and now we can be children, and we can be adolescents in perpetuity.
Right.
I don't know. Who knows? Perhaps we can. Perhaps we can print money. We can have the Federal Reserve. We can have this sort of magic um, trade between China and that's enables this kind of lifestyle where we can just consume and produce less and less, and
Right.
I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't think that's the case. But
Right.
That's
I
something
don't
that we-
either, but it's right.
yeah, but no, I think all of this maybe teaches you that I think you're absolutely right, and you've been right about this for a long time. Ever since the 1940s when you were a cardiology fellow, and you've been you've been saying about the important thing is really principles. You have to come back to principles. What are your core values that you fight for, or that are worth fighting for?
Right.
What is the way you want to set up society?
Right. But the
And
principles
don't
should
get
right.
caught up- and don't get caught up in this consequential nature of like, well, okay,
Right.
how am I doing at this point based on what metric and stuff? You really, you have to live a society of a certain way, and in the end of the day, that's I think probably what's important.
Right.
So,
but the principles have to be, so people will often think of principles as being kind of arbitrary because you can't really ground them into anything, and I don't think that's
the next
true.
question. What should they be grounded in?
Right. Next time, I think we should talk about principles of medicine. Why don't we talk about what medicine is about, what it should be about?
Yeah.
Because I think we can make an inventory of the different theories out there.
Sure.
And I think it's important to have some clarity on what it is before we can even think about what the medical system should be like.
Right.
It should be so.
Yeah.
All right.
Sir, excellent conversation as always. In India, we talk about gurus. So thank you for being the guru, the teacher.
You're welcome. What's a student? What's the word for students, for pupil?
I'm forgetting, embarrassingly enough.
Okay, we'll have Dr. Venkatesh back on to let us know. Okay. All right, Anish. Take care. Bye.
Bye.